Okay, well, that was not planned. We were pretty close to starting anyway. So I just wanted to make sure that my captions were working, but clicked on the wrong thing. Anyway, all right. Well, the end of the book. The end of the book. 2 chapters plus some other stuff. For some reason, they put an interlude in between chapters 18 and 19, um, which is like a little three pages, and then there is a postscript that's like 4 pages. So we're not going to read the appendices because they're just lists of like soldiers that were in the field lodges during the Revolutionary War, stuff like that. So we won't get into that, but we'll get into these last 2 chapters. All right, so let's just jump straight on into it. We have a fairly long reading to do to finish. So, chapter 18, The War for Independence. On the same day that the Second Continental Congress convened, Ethan Allen, along with Arnold, who was then his lieutenant, launched a surprise attack on Ticonderoga, the fort so bitterly contested a generation before. Stores of weapons and munitions were captured, including artillery. 5 weeks later, the colonists, working secretly during the night, preempted British plans to fortify Boston by erecting their own emplacements on 2 ridges overlooking the city, Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. Their nominal commander was Brigadier Artemus Ward, another veteran of the French Indian War, but their guiding spirit was Joseph Warren of St. Andrew's Lodge. General Thomas Gage was subsequently to be blamed for what happened next, but the real responsibility lay with Sir William Howe, who commanded in the field. It was Howe who had the authority, once the true nature of the situation became clear, to revoke the plan of battle or adhere to it and suffer the inevitable cost. For a veteran subordinate of Amherst and Wolfe, Howe behaved strangely indeed. Despite the stifling heat, Howe ordered his troops to advance in close ranks, with full equipment weighing more than 100 pounds per man, directly into the face of the colonists' fire, and to take the emplacements by storm, with the bayonet. The colonists' fire, loosed in well-disciplined volleys, learned from the British Army during the French Indian War, was withering, and it took Howe's soldiers 4 assaults to carry the position. When they did, having sustained more than 200 killed and nearly 800 wounded out of some 2,500 men engaged, they were not disposed to be gentle. Warren died on a British bayonet, and those of his colleagues who did not flee were annihilated. The colonists' losses were in excess of 400. Now, right off the bat, we have a map. I think it's the only picture in this chapter. American War for Independence with the campaign of 1777. So I'll do like I did last time. I'll just come in as close as I can and hopefully get it to... There we go. I don't know if you can read all that. I can't quite make out some of it myself, just because of the view I happen to have. Oop, oh, damn it. There we go. Ticonderoga. Saratoga, 1777. Valley Forge. Howe defeats Washington. There we go. And all the way down here, Charleston, Savannah. Okay, so Bunker Hill is important because it was the first major face-to-face confrontation between colonials and British regulars. It was also the first full-scale, full-fledged battle of the war, as opposed to the minor skirmishing at Lexington and Concord. But it is also important by virtue of Howe's curious behavior and conduct of the action. Howe, it must be remembered, had learned irregular tactics under his elder brother George, under Amherst, and under Wolfe. Throughout his military career, both before and after Bunker Hill, he eschewed the costly, wasteful frontal assaults against an entrenched position, the kind of assault in which, after all, his elder brother had died at Ticonderoga in 1758. At Bunker Hill he had a number of alternatives open to him. He could perhaps have dislodged the colonists from their emplacements with artillery fire. He could certainly have cut them off and waited them out, letting them succumb to hunger, thirst, and shortage of ammunition. He could probably have deployed his grenadier companies and his light infantry in the kind of imaginative ways he had learned from Amherst and Wolfe 20 years before, and in which he was to deploy them on subsequent occasions later in the war. However, having fought alongside colonial troops during the French and Indian War, Howe knew better than any other British officer in Boston at the time how tough they could be, how well drilled and disciplined in the British Army's own techniques of volley firing. In doing what he did at Bunker Hill, it is almost as if Howe, having repeatedly stated his reluctance to fight against the colonists, were sending a signal to his masters in London. You want me to fight? Very well, I'll fight, but this is what it'll cost you. This is the kind of mess you'll be getting us into. Do you really want to continue such lunacy? This would not have been cynicism on Howe's part. Neither would it have been the wanton squandering of 1,000 men simply to make a point. On the contrary, Howe, knowing full well what Britain was getting into, would have thought in strategic terms, and thinking in strategic terms, he might well have concluded it worth the sacrifice of 1,000 men if, by so doing, he could avert the loss of many times that number in subsequent engagements. But even if this were the lesson Howe sought to convey to London, it failed to register. True, he might have thought initially that he had got his way. He himself was exculpated for the casualties at Bunker Hill. Gage was blamed, and the British Army evacuated Boston. But Howe then found himself in the position he least wanted to occupy, replacing Gage, saddled with the responsibilities of commander-in-chief and obliged to continue operations against the colonists. He was never again to squander troops as he had at Bunker Hill. On the contrary, he repeatedly, in the campaigns that followed, went out of his way to spare lives, both those of his own men and those of the colonists. But his behavior was to be no less equivocal, no less ambiguous. The British Spy Network. Despite the loss of blood at Bunker Hill, or perhaps because of it, the colonists, guided largely by the Freemasons among them, still sought to avert a complete rupture with Britain. On 5 July, the Continental Congress adopted the so-called Olive Branch Petition to George III, appealing for a peaceful settlement of differences. This was followed a day later by yet another resolution, declaring that the colonies did not desire independence, but would not yield to enslavement. On 23 August, however, the Olive Branch Petition was summarily rejected, and the king declared Britain's North American colonies to be in open rebellion. Events had thus assumed a momentum of their own, and were escalating beyond what all the major factions had anticipated or desired. On 9 November, a special committee, the Committee of Congress for Secret Correspondence, was appointed to establish a network of contacts among our friends abroad. This, quote-unquote, our friends abroad. This committee consisted of Robert Morris, John Jay, Benjamin Harrison, John Dickinson, and Benjamin Franklin. It was to operate extensively through Freemasonic channels and to lead to the creation of an elaborate spy network. At the same time, and quite coincidentally, it was to overlap a British spy network which ran parallel to it and also operated through Freemasonic channels. Both networks were to be based primarily in Paris, which became the center for a vast web of espionage, intrigue, and shifting allegiances. Franklin, as we have seen, was a Freemason of long standing, having been initiated nearly a half a century before in 1731. In 1734 and again in 1749 he had been Grand Master of Pennsylvania. In 1756 he had been inducted into the Royal Society, still at the time strongly oriented towards Freemasonry. Between 1757 and 1762, and again between 1764 and 1775, he had spent considerable time abroad in England and in France. In 1776, as the conflict in the colonies became a full-fledged war for independence, Franklin became, in effect, the American ambassador to France, and was to serve in this capacity until 1785. In 1778, in Paris, he was to become a member of a particularly important French lodge. I'm going to butcher this. It's Nine Sisters, but neuf soir. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 soirs. I do kind of remember how to count in French, so so yeah, neuf, but I can't make out the other word. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's Nine Sisters, which was also to include such luminaries as John Paul Jones, first initiated in Scotland in 1770, and Voltaire. A year later, on 21 May 1779, Franklin became master of Neuf Sours. I'll just say Sours. A post to which he was re-elected in 1780. In 1782, he became a member of a more elusive and mysterious Freemasonic conclave, the Royal Lodge de Commandeur du Temple à l'Ouest de Carcassonne. Royal Lodge of Commanders of the Temple West of Carcassonne. Carcassonne? No, I don't think the E would be pronounced. From the 1750s until 1775, Franklin was Deputy Postmaster General for the American colonies. In this capacity, he had become particularly friendly with his opposite numbers, the joint British Postmasters General, Sir Francis Dashwood, and the Earl of Sandwich. Dashwood's Freemasonic affiliations are unclear. It is probable that he was a member of the lodge founded in Florence in 1733 by his close friend Charles Sackville, Earl of Middlesex. Both he and Sackville were also members of the coterie of Freemasons attached to Frederick, Prince of Wales. Subsequently, he was to create what amounted to a private Freemasonic lodge of his own. In 1732, Dashwood had co-founded a quasi-Masonic society, the Dilettanti, while traveling abroad between 1739 and 1741, he had moved in Jacobite circles, becoming a close friend and, for a time, staunch supporter of Charles Edward Stuart. This brought him into contact with prominent Jacobites in England, such as George Lee, Earl of Lichfield, who had helped his cousin, Charles Radcliffe, escape from Newgate prison, and who, along with the Duke of Wharton, another fervent Jacobite and influential Freemason, had co-founded the original Hellfire Club. In 1746, Dashwood co-created, along with the Earl of Sandwich and 2 others, the ironically named Order of St. Francis, which has since become known in the popular mind, and for later historians, by the same name as Wharton's and Lichfield's earlier organization. Indeed, it is now Dashwood who is generally associated erroneously with the Hellfire Club, although his Franciscans were involved in pretty much the same kind of neo-pagan orgiastic activities. In 1761, Dashwood became Member of Parliament for Weymouth and Melcombe Regis. In 1762, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under the Earl of Bute. A year later, he became Lord Despencer and Lord Lieutenant of the Buckinghamshire, as well as commander of the Buckinghamshire militia, in which one of his subordinates was another maverick and already notorious MP, John Wilkes. He became Joint Postmaster General in 1766. His first colleague in this post was Willis Hill, Lord Hillsborough, a co-founder, along with the Duke of Wharton and Earl of Lichfield, of the original Hellfire Club. Hill was then succeeded by the Earl of Sandwich. Sandwich had met Dashwood around 1740, and the two were to become lifelong friends. Not surprisingly, Sandwich became a member first of Dashwood's Dilettanti, then of the Order of St. Francis. He remained Postmaster General until 1771, when he became the first Lord of the Admiralty, a post he occupied through most of the American War for Independence. He did so with protuberant ineptitude, earning even from so cautious and restrained a source as the Britannica the statement, quote, "For corruption and incapacity, Sandwich's administration is unique in the history of the British Navy," end quote. During the summers of 1772, 73, and 74, Franklin stayed at Dashwood's home in West Wycombe. They collaborated on an abridgment of the Book of Common Prayer. Quote, "The preface and services were Dashwood's work, edited by Franklin. The Catechism and the Psalms were Franklin's work, and edited by Dashwood. The finished text was printed at Dashwood's expense." End quote. And Franklin, that snuff-colored little man, as D.H. Lawrence called him, sanctimonious author of Poor Richard's Almanac, proponent of temperance, frugality, industry, moderation, and cleanliness, while primly exhorting his readers not to use venery, became a member of Dashwood's Franciscans. A paragon of moral rectitude at home, Franklin, in England, would apparently let his wig down, and the caves under Dashwood's estate at West Wycombe would become a boudoir for the cavortings of libidinous postmasters general. I've never seen that word in print before. Sorry. To judge by a letter from Sandwich to Dashwood in September 1769, they had not much else to do. Quote, "I am almost ashamed to write to you upon post office business, having been so idle for the whole summer, but indeed there is so little business that requires our attendance, and we have the good fortune to agree so perfectly well in everything that requires an opinion, that there is very little occasion we should put ourselves to any inconvenience by a personal attendance." End quote. In fact, however, there was more to the matter than that, because it afforded access to virtually all letters, all communications. The position of Postmaster General was also traditionally that of Spy Master, and during the American War for Independence, their experience as Postmaster General was to stand both Dashwood and Franklin in good stead. In his dual role of Spy Master and Colonial Ambassador to France, Franklin established his center of operations in Paris. He was accompanied here by two other appointees of the Congressional Committee for Secret Correspondence, Silas Deane and Arthur Lee. Lee's brother was based in London. So too was Franklin's sister, who is also believed to have been engaged in espionage. She had long been a good friend of Howe's brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, commander of naval operations in the colonial theater. In 1774, she had brought Franklin and the admiral together, ostensibly to play chess, and they frequently discussed the colonists' grievances. In 1781, an open letter was published by one Cicero, who accused the Howe brothers of belonging to a faction which conspired to facilitate the colonists' bid for independence. Washington's whole conduct, Cicero charged, demonstrated a confidence which could arise from nothing short of certain knowledge. He explicitly accused Admiral Howe of having secret intrigues with Dr. Franklin. The admiral replied in a newspaper, declaring that Cicero is perfectly right as to the fact, though a little deceived in his inferences. At the same time, however, he admitted that he had withheld knowledge of his meetings with Franklin from his naval high command, which suggests that he might indeed have had something to hide. One of the most important agents for the colonists in England was Dashwood's former friend, fellow MP, and associate club member, John Wilkes. Wilkes had become an active Freemason in 1769, and by 1774 was Lord Mayor of London. In this capacity, he was publicly vociferous on behalf of the colonists' cause, but since the late 1760s, he had also been the secret British representative of the Boston-based Sons of Liberty, who had played so crucial a role in the Tea Party. Throughout the war, Wilkes was clandestinely raising money for the Continental Army and remitting it to Franklin in Paris. From Paris, it was either passed on to North America or used to purchase arms and material. Oddly enough, a letter of 1777 suggests that although Wilkes's network was penetrated, nothing was ever done about it. The British spy network, also run from Paris, was officially under the auspices of William Eden, Lord Auckland, another eminent man whose Masonic history has eluded investigators. In 1770, he had become Grand Steward of Grand Lodge, but no details exist of when, where, or by whom he was initiated. Auckland's network, operating in large part through sea captains trading between France and North America, included those who carried dispatches between Franklin and Congress. As late as 10 December 1777, one of these captains, a man from Maryland named Heinsohn, reported to Auckland of Franklin that, quote, whenever Great Britain would show a disposition for peace, he would be the first to give up his independence, end quote. According to Franklin, Silas Deane was of little mind. Heinsohn said that Franklin had misgivings, however, about Arthur Lee, who, quote, lived in a higher style than he had ever done and had a great deal of pride, end quote. Lee would not want to lose his status and was content to see the war continue. Apart from his maritime agents, Lord Auckland had one of the particular importance in Paris. This was Dr. Edward Bancroft, a distinguished naturalist and chemist. Before the war, Bancroft had been a close friend of Franklin's. In 1773, Franklin had sponsored his nomination as a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was also a close friend of Silas Deane's. Not knowing that Bancroft was a British agent, Deane, on being dispatched to Paris, promptly sent for him. Bancroft, or his masters, staged a charade whereby they appeared to be forced to flee England in order to join Deane in France. Here he became not only Deane's confidant, but Franklin's as well. By 1777, he had even become Franklin's private secretary, and in 1779 he became a member of the prestigious Nine Sisters Lodge, of which Franklin in that year was master. Through Bancroft, the British government was kept apprised not only of the colonists' activities, but also of French plans for entering the war. In theory, at least, Britain could therefore have anticipated and moved to thwart such developments as the French contribution to the colonial victory at Yorktown. But with Lord Sandwich as First Lord of the Admiralty, and with Admiral Lord Richard Howe commanding the fleet in North American waters, the Royal Navy displayed the same dilatory conduct as the Army's high command. In retrospect, it is clear that the intelligence Bancroft provided was sound. In 1785, Parliament was to reward him by giving him a period of monopoly over the import of a certain vegetable dye used for printing calico. a process which he had pioneered. Nevertheless, the king, who personally read all intelligence reports, did not trust him and suspected him of being a double agent for the colonists. Of especially questionable character was a clandestine mission Bancroft undertook to Ireland in 1779. In March 1780, Lord Stormont, the British ambassador to France, wrote to the king that a secret Irish delegation consisting of allied Catholics and Independents had arrived in Paris the previous December and met with Louis XVI. According to Stormont, quote, "They propose that Ireland shall be an independent kingdom, that there shall be a sort of Parliament, but no king, that the Protestant religion shall be the established religion, but that the Roman Catholic shall have the fullest toleration. The delegates are closely connected with Franklin, who my informer thinks carries on a correspondence by means of Franklin's sister, a Mrs. Johnstone, now in London, who has a small lodging in Fountain Court in the Strand." End quote. Wow. I'm going along with what? Holy. What? Did it? Jiminy Christmas. We have a long way to go just to get through this chapter. Okay. Plowing on. Definitely going to have to take a break in this session. From these seeds, some 20 years later, a new quasi-Masonic organization was to spring, the Society of United Irishmen, under the aegis of such men as Lord Edward Fitzgerald and Wolfe Tone. Their activities were to culminate in the Irish rebellions of 1798 and 1803. In the meantime, the British spy network under Lord Auckland continued to penetrate, but not exploit, that of the colonists. In this process, Sir Francis Dashwood, as Postmaster General, was of particular importance. Again and again Dashwood intercepted the colonists' correspondence and communiques and passed them on to Auckland, but what is most extraordinary is that during the whole of this time Dashwood and Franklin appear to have maintained personal contact by their own secret channels of communication. Thus, for example, one of Dashwood's agents, a certain John Norris, reports in a letter dated 3 June 1778, quote, "Did this day heliograph intelligence from Dr. Franklin in Paris to Wycombe," end quote. At least one commentator has concluded that that Franklin was actually a British agent. If that were the case, however, something of the contact between Dashwood and Franklin would unquestionably have surfaced among Lord Auckland's papers, or those of some other British authorities, or even the King's. The fact that it doesn't suggests the contacts were not sanctioned by or known to British intelligence. In all likelihood, Dashwood and Franklin, who were, after all, old friends and colleagues, were playing a harmless game of their own, exchanging gossip, irrelevant tittle-tattle, and or simple disinformation. Although Dashwood was opposed to the war, there is no suggestion that he was engaged in treason. On the contrary, he appears to have discharged his duties, if only to the minimal degree required of him, conscientiously enough. In this respect, his behavior is strikingly similar to that of British military and naval commanders. In North America, the momentum of events had accelerated dramatically. By the time the Congressional Committee for Secret Correspondence was formed, the colonists had already embarked on an ambitious and misguided offensive. A substantial force under General Richard Montgomery attempted to invade Canada. On 13 November 1775, they managed to capture Montreal, but Montgomery, despite having served under Wolfe and Amherst, then made the mistake of trying to take Quebec by storm. The colonists' assault was repulsed with heavy casualties. The contingent was decimated, and Montgomery himself was killed, but the British commander in Canada, Sir Guy Carleton, was a close friend of Howe's and shared Howe's diffidence about the war. Not only did Carleton not bother to pursue the shattered colonial forces, he also released the prisoners he had captured. In the beginning of 1776, the more moderate Freemasonic-oriented factions in the Continental Congress still prevailed. Their position had been enunciated once again the previous December when Congress again defied Parliament but continued to affirm allegiance to the Crown. Now, however, the mood began to change and more radical elements began to gain the ascendancy. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, quote-unquote, Common Sense, did much to polarize attitudes and convert many hitherto loyal colonists to the principle of independence from the mother country. On 7 June, Arthur Lee's brother, Richard Henry Lee, proposed officially that the colonies should become quote-unquote free and independent states. By then, too, Franklin's embassy had begun to bear fruit. Louis XVI of France had pledged 1,000,000 livres of munitions, and a comparable commitment was elicited from Spain, Britain's other major continental antagonist. Those contributions were to sustain the colonial army for nearly 2 years. On 11 June, Congress appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. Of the 5 men on this committee, 2, Franklin and Richard Montgomery's father-in-law, Robert Livingston, were Freemasons, and 1, Roger Sherman, is believed, though not confirmed, to have been. The other 2, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were not, despite subsequent claims to the contrary. The text of the Declaration was composed by Jefferson. It was submitted to Congress and accepted on 4 July 1776. The 9 signatories who can now be established as proven Freemasons, and the 10 who were possibly so, included such influential figures as Washington, Franklin, and of course the president of the Congress, John Hancock. The army, moreover, remained almost entirely in Freemasonic hands. As we have seen, the Freemasons in Congress and the military initially resisted total independence. Once the die had been cast, however, they were to set about getting their own particular ideals enshrined in the institutions of the emergent republic. As we shall see, it is in the Constitution that the influence of Freemasonry is most discernible. When it was first promulgated, the Declaration of Independence must have appeared both a quixotic gesture and a forlorn hope. Certainly the situation of the colonists at the time was far from promising, and was soon to become bleaker still. In March, Howe had indeed evacuated Boston, only to land on 22 August in New York. At the Battle of Brooklyn, sometimes called the Battle of Long Island, he lost 65 killed and 255 wounded, while inflicting more than 2,000 casualties on his adversaries. Instead of pursuing the defeated colonists, however, he allowed them to escape. In the campaign that followed, he displayed the same lassitude. At Harlem Heights, for example, opposite where Columbia University now stands, he procrastinated for 4 weeks before ordering the assault that carried the colonists' position. When Fort Washington was captured, Hessian troops began bayoneting prisoners, and Howe lost his temper with the German mercenaries. But not even Howe's gentlemanly conduct could spare the Continental Army from what followed. Forced to evacuate Brooklyn, Washington withdrew to Manhattan, only to be dislodged from there in turn, and on 15 September, Howe occupied New York. Subsequent engagements compelled Washington to retreat through New Jersey, then across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. By that time, the Continental Army had been reduced from 13,000 men to 3,000. At Fort Lee alone, it had lost 140 cannon. Again, however, Howe displayed a curious diffidence, contriving to procrastinate and mark time while his beleaguered quarry escaped. It is significant that during the following year, the year of Washington's most severe defeats, he, not Howe, was on the offensive. Howe did not seek him out. He sought out Howe. When he did, Howe reacted cursorily, almost like a man swatting away a fly and going back to sleep. Thus, on 26 December 1776, Washington made his famous crossing of the Delaware and fell in a surprise attack on a detachment of Hessians at Trenton, eluding the main British force under Cornwallis. He then, on 3 January 1777, won a second victory at Princeton against a smaller contingent. Instead of responding, however, Howe, whose army was vastly superior in both numbers and supplies, simply abandoned New Jersey and moved into Pennsylvania. On 11 September, he brushed aside Washington's assault at Brandywine. Instead of pursuing, however, he proceeded to occupy Philadelphia, whence the Continental Congress had hastily fled, and established winter quarters. 3 weeks later, on 4 October, Washington attacked again at Germantown. Again Howe repulsed him, this time inflicting particularly heavy casualties. His army plagued by disease, desertion, low morale, and lack of supplies, Washington withdrew into his own winter quarters at Valley Forge. With gentlemanly good sportsmanship, Howe left him alone to lick his wounds and rebuild his shattered army. In this process of rebuilding the Continental Army, Freemasonry was to play a particularly significant role. Lured by the dreams which Freemasonry had helped to inculcate, professional soldiers from abroad crossed the Atlantic and rallied to the colonists' cause. There was, for example, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian veteran recruited by Franklin and Dean, who became Washington's drill master, bringing with him the discipline and professionalism of Frederick the Great's army. Steuben almost single-handedly turned the raw colonial recruits into an efficient fighting force. There is also the Frenchman Johann de Kalb, another veteran of the European battlefields, who was to become perhaps the most competent and reliable of Washington's subordinate commanders. There was Casimir Pulaski, a passionately committed Pole, destined to die of his wounds at the siege of Savannah. From Poland, too, came Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who constructed the elaborate fortification for West Point and became the colonists' leading military architect and engineer. Finally, of course, there was the 20-year-old Marquis de Lafayette, whose status and charismatic personality compensated for his lack of military experience and had a dramatic effect on morale, while his diplomatic activity was to prove crucial. Indeed, he was probably more responsible than anyone else for bringing France into the war, and this, in turn, made possible the final victory at Yorktown. With the exception of Kosciuszko, on whom no relevant information survives, all of these men were known or probable Freemasons. Lafayette and Steuben in particular saw themselves as contributing to the foundation of the ideal Freemasonic Republic. The debacle at Saratoga. With the defeats of Brandywine and Germantown and the demoralizing winter at Valley Forge, 1777 was an especially disastrous year for Washington. To the north of his sphere of operations, however, there occurred what was to prove, with the wisdom of hindsight, the single most critical engagement of the war. Washington played no direct part in it, neither did Howe, but Howe, by virtue of that very fact, once again demonstrated the curious diffidence and apathy so characteristic of him throughout the conflict. Indeed, the evidence suggests he may, in this instance, have been demonstrating something more. As we have seen, the war was extremely unpopular. It was unpopular with British commanders in North America, the Howe brothers, Cornwallis, and Clinton, and it was unpopular with members of both parties at home. Edmund Burke, for example, was eloquently outspoken against repression of the colonies. So too was Charles Fox. William Pitt, Earl of Chatham, who had presided over the conquest of North America from the French 20 years before, made a number of impassioned speeches in Parliament calling for conciliation, and died as he was concluding one of them. Pitt's son, then serving as aide to Sir Guy Carleton, or Guy Carleton, in Canada, had been ordered by his father to resign his commission rather than fight against the colonists. The Earl of Effingham also resigned. Admiral Augustus Keppel, who succeeded Sandwich as First Lord of the Admiralty, publicly declared that he would not engage in operations against men whom he regarded as compatriots. As far as is known, no such public statement was made by George Rodney, the greatest naval commander of the age, but it is clear that Rodney felt the same way, studiously avoiding any action in American waters until the war had been decided, and only then moving into the Caribbean to inflict a dramatic defeat on the French fleet. And as we have seen, Amherst, commander-in-chief of the army and acknowledged master of campaigning in North America, similarly refused to take the field. In Canada, Sir Guy Carleton shared the diffidence of his friend, Sir William Howe. Among the upper echelons of the British establishment, military, naval, and civic resistance to the war was virtually unanimous, as was antipathy to its chief propagator in England, Lord George Germain. There was only one notable exception, one man who both curried favor with Germain and advocated a ruthless suppression of the colonists, Sir John Gentlemanly John Burgoyne. A dandy and a minor playwright in England, Burgoyne, prior to the outbreak of hostilities in 1775, had seen no previous service in North America. For him alone among the British commanders, North America was an alien world. During the 7 Years' War, he had been based in England, participating in a series of half-hearted raids on the French coast. Subsequently, he had raised his own regiment of light cavalry and taken his men to Portugal, where they fought as volunteers in that country's conflict with Spain. Having routed the Spanish forces at Villa Velha in 1762, Burgoyne returned to England with a reputation for resourcefulness and dash. He never became a Freemason. At the time of Bunker Hill, he was serving under Howe in Boston. Then in February 1776, he was appointed second in command to Sir Guy Carleton in Quebec, and saw action in Canada during the abortive invasion by Richard Montgomery. Burgoyne vigorously disapproved of the apparent hesitancy with which Carleton, like Howe to the south, conducted operations. As we have seen, Carleton released the prisoners captured in the assault on Quebec. On another occasion, he released an additional 110 colonial captives, including one general, gave them food and shoes, and allowed them to return home. In at least one instance, he also deliberately issued orders that allowed the retreating colonists to escape. For Burgoyne, such behavior was inexcusable. He was contemptuous of anyone and anything foreign, and alone among the British commanders he applied that adjective to the colonists. He regarded them as something between vermin and spoiled children sorely in need of what a later age would call a short, sharp shock. Haughtily insensitive to their grievances, he had no compunction whatever about suppressing them as ruthlessly as circumstance allowed. They did not merit, as far as he was concerned, the gentlemanly treatment of Carleton and Howe. In November 1776, Burgoyne returned to England, where he curried further favor with his friend and patron, Lord George Germain. Through Germain's offices, he also became a personal confidant of the king. This enabled him to go behind the backs of his superiors in North America and sell his own ambitious plan for ending the war at a single stroke. He himself would implement the plan and reap the glory that accrued. The plan required elaborate orchestration, choreography, and timing. It entailed a sizable British column under Burgoyne's own command striking southwards from Canada, advancing down towards Albany through the old forts at Ticonderoga and Crown Point, the hilly, heavily wooded terrain through which Amherst and Wolfe had fought their way 20 years before, but of which Burgoyne himself had no experience whatever. Howe, meanwhile, would effectively be deprived of independent command. He would lead his forces, then based around Manhattan, northwards to link up with Burgoyne at Albany. Thus, quote, 2 armies, one from the north in Canada and one from the south, should march to a juncture, cutting the colonies into 2 separate sections, after which the separated areas could be conquered individually. In effect, the whole of New England would have been cut off from the colonies to the south. According to one commentator, Burgoyne was confident that he would secure glory, position, honor, and a favored place in history. Burgoyne's plan was certainly ambitious. Whether it might have succeeded in more competent hands is questionable, and even if it had succeeded, the value of the results might well have been negligible, since by 1777 the major theaters of operations had shifted far to the south, and New England had become strategically irrelevant. Nevertheless, Germain and the king bought the idea. Sir Guy Carleton was to be replaced by Burgoyne as commander-in-chief in Canada, and was notified accordingly in March 1777. Carleton promptly resigned, but remained in Quebec long enough to outfit Burgoyne and see him on his way. Burgoyne, after their previous quarrels, was surprised by the readiness with which Carleton cooperated. Sir Guy, Burgoyne wrote, quote, could not have shown more zeal than he did to comply with and expedite my requisitions and desires. End quote. In fact, Carleton was simply in a hurry to get Burgoyne out of his hair and absolve himself of the whole matter. But Carleton also recognized, as we shall see, that the faster Burgoyne embarked on his march, the more certainly he would be marching to his doom. Knowing full well what must happen, Carleton was expediting not the success of Burgoyne's enterprises, but its inevitable ruin. The success of Burgoyne's plan hinged... Jesus Christ. We're still... Holy shit. We're still 6 pages from the end of this chapter. I knew this was going to be a long reading session. Sorry, but... Wow. The success of Burgoyne's plan hinged ultimately on the cooperation of Howe, who was engaged at the time in operations around Manhattan. In order for the plan to succeed, Howe had to carry out his part of it by moving northwards with his army and linking up with Burgoyne at Albany. Burgoyne assumed that Lord Germain, his friend and patron back in England, would issue the requisite orders compelling Howe's compliance, personal objections notwithstanding. Certainly that responsibility did rest with Germain, and it is Germain, therefore, who has usually taken the blame for what followed. Unquestionably, Germain was partially culpable, partially guilty of negligence. The generally accepted story is that he was anxious to go on holiday. Not wanting to keep his coach waiting in the road, he hurriedly signed Burgoyne's orders, but as Howe had not yet been properly copied, he simply neglected them. So, at any rate, wrote the Earl of Shelburne in what has come to be one of the standard indictments of Germain, quote, and it's a long quote, among many singularities he had a particular aversion to being put out of his way on any occasion. He had fixed to go into Kent or Northamptonshire at a particular hour, and to call on his way to his office to sign the dispatches, all of which had been settled to both these generals. By some mistake, those to General Howe were not fair copied, and upon his growing impatient at it, the office, which was a very idle one, comprised to send it to the country after him, while they dispatched the others to General Burgoyne, expecting that the others could be expedited before the packet sailed with the first. which, however, by some mistake sailed without them, and the wind detained the vessel which was ordered to carry the rest. Hence came General Burgoyne's defeat, the French declaration, and the loss of the 13 colonies. It might appear incredible if his own secretary and the most respectable persons in office had not assured me of the fact. What corroborates it is that it can be accounted for no other way." End quote. Lord Shelburne, in his account, is not wholly correct. What happened can be accounted for in another way, or at any rate, in a way that adds a complementary dimension to Shelburne's version. For while Germain may indeed have neglected to sign the requisite orders personally, they were nevertheless signed and sent to Howe. They were signed by a man named D'Oyley, a deputy secretary at the War Office. Howe is known to have received them on 24 May 1777. That they did not bear Germain's personal signature is beside the point. Howe should still, in theory, have been obliged to act in accordance with them. What is more, Howe already knew what he was supposed to be doing. Quote, "Granting that Lord George was a difficult man to like or respect, nonetheless his inexcusable negligence in not making certain his orders reached Sir William at New York are only one side of the calamitous error. On the other side was General Howe's positive knowledge that, as Burgoyne marched south, the Americans were closing in around him." End quote. Indeed, so positive was Howe's knowledge that he even provided Burgoyne with intelligence to that effect. Howe, quote, "told Burgoyne that the American Northern Army was about to be reinforced by 2,500 fresh troops. Howe also knew that the rebel General Israel Putnam, with 4,000 more troops, was at Peekskill between Clinton at New York City and Burgoyne at Fort Edward." End quote. A brief scrutiny of the precise sequence of events reveals the way in which Howe and Carleton jointly contrived to ensure Burgoyne's failure, and through the unexpected additional boon of Germain's negligence to foist the whole of the blame onto him. At the beginning of 1777, Howe, as we have seen, decided to abandon New Jersey to Washington and to advance on the colonial capital of Philadelphia. He notified Germain of his intentions, and Germain on 3 March approved. On 26 March, however, there occurred the contretemps described above. Germain issued official orders for Burgoyne to march south and for Howe to link up with him at Albany. These orders were dispatched with Germain's signature to Burgoyne. They were dispatched according to the War Office with D'Oyley's signature to Howe, who received them on 24 May. Wow. But a full 7 weeks before, on 2 April, Howe had already written to Carleton in Canada that he would not be able to offer much assistance to Burgoyne, quote, "as I shall probably be in Pennsylvania." End quote. In other words, Howe, 7 weeks before receiving his orders, already knew what he would be expected to do and had already decided not to do it. Carleton received Howe's letter before Burgoyne began his advance southwards from Quebec on 13 June, but Carleton not only neglected to warn Burgoyne, but even hastened Burgoyne on his way, with a zeal that the gratified Burgoyne found surprising. It is thus clear that Howe and Carleton, taking advantage of the slowness of communication and the general vagueness of orders, contrived to exculpate themselves while allowing Burgoyne to march to a defeat which was a foregone conclusion, and Germain, on his part, by continuing to be vague, unwittingly aided them in their subsequent self-exoneration. Wow. On 18 May, Germain wrote to Howe. Weirdly enough, he endorsed Howe's advance on Philadelphia, quote, "trusting, however, that whatever you may meditate, it will be executed in time for you to cooperate with the army ordered to proceed from Canada." End quote. It is extraordinary that Germain can have can have been so naive as to think that Howe would possibly advance southwards into Pennsylvania and then manage to march north to link up with Burgoyne in time. Howe himself was not so naive. He did not even pretend to make haste. On the contrary, he moved in a downright leisurely fashion. When Germain's letter reached him on 16 August, he was on a ship in the Chesapeake Bay en route for Philadelphia. On the same day, the Hessians in the vanguard of Burgoyne's column made contact with the colonists at Bennington and were wiped out. Quote, when Howe decided to abandon Burgoyne, it is difficult to imagine how he expected Burgoyne to reach Albany. There can be little doubt that with or without Germain's orders, Sir William Howe must have had some inkling that Burgoyne was marching straight into very serious trouble, and yet did nothing to make certain Burgoyne would not be badly, even fatally mauled. End quote. On 30 July, Burgoyne, advancing through the forested wilderness of upstate New York, had dispatched a worried letter to Germain complaining that he had no idea of Howe's intentions. This seems to have been his first intimation of danger. On 20 August, 4 days after the defeat at Bennington, he dispatched a second letter. By that time, Howe was already marching into Pennsylvania. On 30 August, Howe wrote bluntly to Germain that he had not the slightest intention of helping Burgoyne. On 11 September, as we have seen, he defeated Washington at Brandywine. On 27 September, he occupied Philadelphia, and a week later, on 4 October, trounced Washington again, even more soundly, at Germantown. Burgoyne, in the meantime, was sinking ever more deeply into the morass of his own making. On 7 October, 3 days after Germantown, his column clashed with the colonists' main force under General Horatio Gates. Repulsed and suffering heavy casualties, Burgoyne fell back on his camp at Saratoga, only to be dislodged from there by Gates' counterattack. At last, on 17 October, completely surrounded, with all routes of retreat cut off and no hope of assistance or relief, Burgoyne surrendered with nearly 6,000 men. 5 days later, Howe, ensconced in his winter quarters at Philadelphia, wrote to Germain, referring to his letter of 2 April, and taking some retrospective liberty with its phraseology, quote, I positively mentioned that no direct assistance could be given by the Southern Army. End quote. From this sequence of events, it is clear that Howe, as early as March, had made up his mind not to go to Burgoyne's aid. He even said as much in his letter to Carleton. Yet neither man, though both knew full well what the consequences would almost certainly be, made any attempt to avert them. Howe, who was obviously opposed to Burgoyne's expedition, never sought to remonstrate with his masters in London, never asserted his authority as commander-in-chief to argue that the plan was misconceived, and Carleton, by hastening Burgoyne on his way, even abetted the eventual outcome. Both men were able to exculpate themselves by taking advantage of the slowness of communications and Germain's long recognized incompetence, as well as by responding to the unwitting vagueness of the orders issued to them with a deliberate vagueness of their own. There is bound to have been one other protagonist in the drama whom later historians have completely overlooked. Amherst, it must be remembered, was commander-in-chief of the army at the time. He was a veteran of the very terrain through which Burgoyne proposed to march. He could readily assess both the dangers and Burgoyne's ineptitude. He was not only Howe's former commander in the field, but also an old friend, and any complaint from Howe would certainly have received a sympathetic hearing. All orders, in theory, should have passed through Amherst's hands. Indeed, strictly speaking, they should have been issued through him, rather than through Germain. At very least, he would have had to be privy to what was happening. And yet Amherst, during the whole sequence of events that culminated with Saratoga, seems to have himself out of existence. There is no record of Howe complaining to him, or, for that matter, of their exchanging letters of any kind. There is no record of his offering a single comment, a single suggestion, a single word of advice. There is no record of his issuing any orders whatever. His sheer invisibility calls attention to itself. If there was indeed a tacit readiness on, or tacit readiness on Howe's and Carleton's parts to see Burgoyne fail, Amherst must also have been involved, and at very least have acquiesced. In any case, and whatever Amherst's role or non-role, the conclusion was inescapable. There can be little doubt that Howe and Carleton wanted Burgoyne to fail. The real reason is the real question is why. Was it simply personal animosity toward Burgoyne? A spiteful desire to see him discredited? That is most unlikely. Granted, both Howe and Carleton disliked Burgoyne intensely and probably justifiably, but it is hardly conceivable that they would have countenanced the sacrifice of an army to satisfy a personal grudge, especially as that sacrifice would serve only to make their own tasks more difficult. Whatever their personal feelings for Burgoyne, they would not have abandoned him to his fate unless it made sense to do so in broader terms, made sense in accordance with some general political perspective on the war, and given Howe's and Carleton's perspective on the war, it did make precisely such sense. Historians have tended to see Howe's abandonment of Burgoyne as either a monstrous blunder resulting from crossed signals, or as an act of outrageous and mystifying negligence. In fact, however, and this is a crucial point, it was perfectly consistent with the way in which Howe and Carleton and Cornwallis had conducted and were to conduct operations throughout the course of the conflict. Burgoyne's disaster also gave Howe an opportunity he had been seeking for some time, an excuse to resign his command without any personal stigma. Within a month of the Battle of Saratoga, he did so. A month later, his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, followed suit. In purely military terms, Saratoga, as we have noted, was not in itself decisive. It did not cripple the British war effort. It did not deplete the manpower available in the war's major theaters of operations. It did not impede the capacity to campaign on the part of other British commanders. On the contrary, Howe's forces were still intact, and the overall strategic position was no worse than it had been before. Had Howe wished to do so, he could still have crushed Washington. But in non-military terms, Saratoga was indeed decisive and did mark the real turning point in the American War for Independence. In the first place, it provided the colonists with a major transfusion of morale precisely when such a transfusion was most desperately needed. In the second place, it prompted France not just to recognize the rebellious colonies as an independent republic, but also to enter the war on their side. This was to make a very crucial strategic difference. It was to bring regular French troops to North America. It was to pit the Royal Navy against a fleet of comparable strength in North American waters, and thereby challenge, even if only temporarily, the British naval blockade. Through the specter of operations on the continent, it was to keep pinned down in England quantities of troops who, in theory at least, might otherwise have been dispatched to the colonies. It was to force Britain to extend itself as far afield as Gibraltar, Minorca, and India. It was in sum to stretch British resources, military, naval, and economic, in a way that made the war increasingly counterproductive. These consequences, however, took time to bite. Until they did, the conflict continued. It continued, in fact, for another 4 years. On 8 January 1778, Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee in Paris negotiated a formal treaty of alliance with France. But in North America proper, the situation of the colonists remained desperate. In May, Howe was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton, the Lord by was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton, with Lord Cornwallis technically under him, but often exercising an independent command. Washington's army became, in effect, a lame duck. It was to suffer 2 more winters as severe as the one at Valley Forge, and was to be plagued after each by crippling mutinies. Neither Clinton nor Cornwallis, however, made any attempt to exploit the situation. In the meantime, the focus of operations shifted to the south. In December 1778, British forces captured Savannah and held it in October of the following year against a determined assault by the colonists. For most of 1779, operations were negligible, but in May 1780, Clinton captured Charlestown, South Carolina, inflicting on the colonists their worst defeat of the war. At the same time, Benedict Arnold entered into secret negotiations with Clinton to turn West Point and the Hudson Valley over to British hands. On 16 August 1780, Cornwallis clashed with Horatio Gates, the victor at Saratoga, at Camden in southern New Jersey. The colonists were again defeated, Baron de Kalb, Gates' second in command, dying in the battle. Gates himself fled the field and was never able subsequently to outlive the ignominy. Campaigning became more and more desultory, with the exception of one further British victory at Guildford Courthouse on 15 March 1781. It degenerated into guerrilla skirmishing. Finally, on 7 August 1781, Cornwallis, who had been raiding in Virginia, established his base at Yorktown and allowed himself to get pinned down there. On 30 August, a French fleet wrested temporary control of the approaches and disembarked forces under Lafayette and Baron von Steuben. Some 3 weeks later, Washington's army arrived, and Cornwallis, with 6,000 troops, found himself besieged by 7,000 colonials and nearly 9,000 French. He held out until 18 October, then surrendered. Even though Clinton, with 7,000 reinforcements, was less than a week's march away. It is obvious that by this time the British High Command had lost all interest in the war, as Cornwallis's soldiers surrendered their commander in a fit of Cornwallis's soldiers surrendered, their commander, in a fit of wry, whimsical good humor, ordered his bands to play a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was rather like saying, with a rueful smile, "Fair cop." Like Saratoga, Yorktown was not in itself militarily decisive. Clinton's army was still intact, and in April 1782 Admiral Rodney cornered the French fleet in the West Indies and utterly destroyed it. Had Britain wished to pursue the war, she could have choked off further French aid to North America, but on 27 February Parliament had already voted down any further action against the colonists, and negotiations for peace began. They took nearly a year, during which all operations were suspended except against remnants of the French fleet at sea. At last, on 4 February 1783, the new British government proclaimed a formal end to hostilities. On 3 September, the Treaty of Paris was signed, whereby the rebellious colonies were recognized as an independent republic, the United States. By November, the last contingents of the British Army had withdrawn from the new nation's soil, and the Continental Army had been disbanded. On 23 December, Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief. Whew. Man. All right, so that got us through Chapter 18. That gets us into the interlude, which is 3 full pages. And then we've got, let me see where we're at. I'm going to take a break, but I want to kind of decide. 2, 3, picture, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages. Then a postscript of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so before I read the interlude, I'm going to go ahead and take a break, and then we'll knock out the rest of this and be finished with this book. It's been a good read, but I'm ready to be done with it because I'm anxious to read 1984. So I will be back in a few minutes, um, and we'll get back to it. Okay, let's get back to it. Apparently my music is not working in that Be Right Back screen. I'll have to fix that. Okay. Interlude. Masonic loyalties. The influence of Freemasonry on the course of the American War for Independence was both direct and oblique, general and particular. In some cases, it served as a conduit for political, even revolutionary activity. Thus, for example, St. Andrew's Lodge in Boston played an important role in the Boston Tea Party, and also in John Hancock provided the Continental Congress a president. Freemasonry imparted its attitudes and values to the newly formed Continental Army and may well have something to do with the appointment of Washington as commander-in-chief. It constituted as well a ready-made fraternal bond with volunteers from abroad such as Steuben and Lafayette. In a less direct, less quantifiable fashion, it helped to create a a general atmosphere, a psychological climate or ambiance which helped shape the thinking not only of active brethren such as Franklin and Hancock, but of non-Freemasons as well. Without 18th century Freemasonry, the principles at the very heart of the conflict, liberty, equality, brotherhood, tolerance, the rights of man, would not have made the currency they did, or not have had the currency they did. True, those principles owed much to Locke, Hume, Adam Smith, and Les Philosophes in France, but most, if not all, of those thinkers were either Freemasons themselves, moved in Freemasonic circles, or were influenced by Freemasonry. But Freemasonry also filtered down to grassroots level. Not only did it help shape the ideals underlying the American War for Independence, not only did it affect the thinking of the politicians and statesmen, the high-level planners and decision-makers. Not only did it color the attitudes of men like Howe, Carleton, Cornwallis, Washington, Lafayette, and Steuben, it also suffused the rank and file of the war, the ordinary soldiers, who found in it a unifying bond and a principle of solidarity. This was particularly true for the Continental Army, where, in the absence of regimental traditions, Freemasonry formed the basis for élan vital and esprit de corps. In the British Army, too, however, Freemasonry forged bonds not just between soldiers, but also between soldiers and their officers. Thus, for example, the Field Lodge of the 29th Foot, later the Worcestershire Regiment, included 2 lieutenant colonels, 2 lieutenants, and 8 privates. The Lodge of the 59th Foot, later the East Lancashire Regiment, included a lieutenant colonel, a major, 2 lieutenants, a surgeon, a music master, 3 sergeants, 2 corporals, and 3 privates. Nor was the influence of Freemasonry confined to the personnel within each of the armies involved. It also obtained between adversaries. The American War for Independence abounds with anecdotes testifying to the way in which Freemasonic loyalties conditioned and even, on occasion, transcended all others. Among the British Army's closest Indian allies during the war were the Mohawks, under their famous chief, Joseph Brant. Brant's sister, prior to the conflict, had married Sir William Johnson, Provincial Grand Master of New York, and an associate of Amherst. On a visit to London in 1776, Brant was himself initiated as a Freemason. Later that year, during the colonists' abortive invasion of Canada, a certain Captain McKinstry was captured by some of Brant's tribesmen, bound to a tree and surrounded with brushwood which the Indians prepared to set alight. When McKinstry made a Masonic appeal, Brant recognized it and ordered him released. He was turned over to a British lodge in Quebec, which arranged his repatriation. Among the prisoners of war taken in Howe's capture of New York was a local Freemason named Joseph Burnham. Burnham managed to escape and, fleeing on foot, sought refuge one night on the planks that formed part of the ceiling of a local lodge. The planks, not having been nailed, gave way, and Burnham landed with a crash among the conclave of startled British officers in the room below. Recognition signs were exchanged, and the British officers made a generous contribution for Brother Burnham, who was afterwards transported with secrecy and expedition to the Jersey shore. On another occasion, Joseph Clement, a British Freemason from the 8th Foot, later the Liverpool Regiment, was serving with a Ranger attachment when, after a skirmish, he saw an Indian preparing to scalp a colonial prisoner. Making a Freemasonic sign to Clement, the prisoner appealed for his protection. Clement ordered the Indian away, then had the prisoner transported to a nearby farmhouse where he was nursed back to health, then sent home. Some months later, in upstate New York, Clement was himself captured and lodged in a local jail. His custodian, it transpired, was the very man whose life he had previously saved, and that night a friend came to him and intimated that at dawn the jail door would be upon the latch, and that outside a horse would be waiting so that he might escape to the frontier. If this kind of rapport existed among officers and men, it also existed among commanders. On 16 August 1780, Cornwallis, as we have seen, clashed with colonial forces under Horatio Gates and Baron de Kalb at the Battle of Camden. When the colonial position collapsed, Gates fled the field, outstripping his troops in his flight. Kalb, traditionally considered a Freemason, was mortally wounded. He was found by Cornwallis's second-in-command, Francis Rawdon, Earl of Moira, who a decade later became acting Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England. Kalb was taken to Moira's tent, where Moira looked after him personally for 3 days. When Kalb died, Moira arranged for a Freemasonic funeral. Within both armies, Freemasonry functioned as a kind of court of appeal for favors and the redress of grievances. To take one example from after the war, the Field Lodge of the 14th Dragoons in 1793 drew up a petition requesting that its parent lodge, Grand Lodge of Ireland, intercede with the Lord Lieutenant or the Commander-in-Chief on behalf of a certain J. Stoddart, the regimental quartermaster. The petition was accordingly sent to Colonel Craddock, commander of the regiment and a fellow Freemason, with the request of his Grand Lodge that he will kindly use his friendly and brotherly influence in behalf of the said Brother Stoddart. Throughout the American War for Independence, there are accounts of the warrants and regalia of field lodges being captured by one side or the other and duly returned. In one instance, the regalia of the 46th Foot, later the 2nd Battalion of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, was captured by colonial troops. On the instructions of George Washington, it was sent back under a flag of truce, with the message that he and his men did not make war upon institutions of benevolence. On another occasion, the warrant of the 17th Foot, later the Leicestershire Regiment, was similarly captured. It, too, was returned with a letter from General Samuel Parsons. This letter is eloquently typical of the spirit fostered by Freemasonry in both armies and all ranks. And the interlude ends with the letter. So the entire thing here is a quote. Brethren, when the ambition of monarchs or the jarring interests of contending states call forth their subjects to war, as Masons we are disarmed of that resentment which stimulates to undistinguished desolation, and however our political sentiments may impel us in the public dispute, we are still brethren, and our professional duty apart ought to promote the happiness and advance the weal of each other. Except, therefore, at the hands of a brother the Constitution of the Lodge Unity No. 18, held in the 17th British Regiment, which your late misfortunes have put it in my power to restore to you. I am your brother and obedient servant, Samuel H. Parsons. So that ends the interlude and takes us into the final chapter, 19, The Republic. In November 1777, shortly after Saratoga, the Continental Congress had agreed, at least in a general way, on the form of government to be adopted for the fledgling republic. This form was to be a federation of states, each of which had formally to ratify the proposed Articles of Confederation. Squabbles about boundaries delayed the process, and the Articles of Confederation were not ratified by all 13 colonies until the beginning of March 1781, 7 months before the British surrender at Yorktown, but another 6 years were to elapse before things advanced significantly further. Between 1783 and 1787, there was a lacuna, as if the colonists, dazed by what they had accomplished, required a pause in which to regain breath and take stock of the situation. Their population, it transpired, was some 211,000 less than it had been before the war. Most of this decline was caused by settlers loyal to the Crown fleeing back to England or, more frequently, to Canada. At last, on 25 May 1787, the Constitutional Convention opened in Philadelphia and commenced its efforts to devise the machinery of government for the new nation. The first voice to make itself heard in any significantly influential way was a characteristically Freemasonic one, that of Edmund Randolph. Most of Randolph's family had remained loyal to the Crown and returned to England in 1775. Randolph himself, however, a member of a Williamsburg lodge, had become Washington's aide-de-camp. Subsequently, he was to become Attorney General, then Governor of Virginia, and Grand Master of Virginia's Grand Lodge. During Washington's presidency, he was to serve as the first Attorney General of the United States, then the first Secretary of State. During the Constitutional Convention, Washington, though elected to preside, took no part in the debates, and it is probable that Randolph, to some degree at least, acted as his mouthpiece or proxy. Randolph proposed that the convention not just review or revise or modify the Articles of Confederation, which had until then held the newly independent colonies together. He proposed that a new basis for central government be established. This proposal was adopted, and a work began to forge the loose confederation of former provinces into a single nation. History had, of course, seen republics before. Indeed, the concept of a republic dated from classical times, from ancient Greece and Rome, in the period prior to the empire, but as the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were only too painfully aware, all such previous republics had been subject to problems as chronic as those which had plagued monarchies. Chief among these, perhaps, was the propensity of republican governments to fall into the hands of dictatorial individuals or dynasties, who would then become as tyrannical as any sovereign or royal house, sometimes even more so. By virtue of this propensity, the very concept of the republic had become badly discredited among 18th century social philosophers. Even among the most enlightened thinkers of the age, there were profound misgivings about whether republicanism was a viable form of government. Hume, for example, had dismissed it as a dangerous novelty. Odious though absolute monarchy might be, he said, it was still preferable. To such problems, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention now addressed themselves. They did so by devising and emphasizing two principles which, taken together, comprised a unique development in the political institution of the age. The first of these principles was that power was to be vested in the office, not in the man, and that the man was to be replaced in office at regular intervals by vote. An individual might occupy a political or governmental position, would discharge the responsibilities attendant upon it, but could not become inseparable from it. This, granted, was hardly a new principle. Again, however, and desirable though it might sound in theory, it had so frequently been abused in practice as to have become discredited. In matters of government especially, the theoretical separation of man from office had betrayed itself too often, and too monstrously, to inspire anything but cynicism. Men such as Locke, Hume, and Adam Smith did not even deign to mention it, and yet Freemasonry was one of the few 18th century institutions in which the principle did function effectively and enjoyed a degree of respectability. Masters and Grand Masters were elected from and by their peers for a stipulated tenure. They did not exercise autocratic power. On the contrary, there could be and often were held they could be and often were held accountable, and when they were deemed unworthy of the office to which they had been elected, they could be impeached or deposed, not by revolution, palace coup, or any other violent means, but by established administrative machinery, nor would the dignity of the office be diminished. In order to ensure the separation of man from office, the Constitutional Convention devised the second of its guiding principles, and the one that represented a unique contribution to the political history of the epoch. According to a system of so-called checks and balances, power was to be equally distributed between two distinct and autonomous governmental bodies, the executive in the form of the presidency and the legislature in the form of the two houses of Congress. By virtue of its autonomy, each of these bodies would be able to forestall any excessive concentration of power in the hands of the other, and the separation of man and office would be guaranteed in both by regular and legally obligatory elections, similar to those which obtained in the lodge system. Such elections were not uncommon elsewhere in the 18th century, but they applied only to the legislative branch of government, which was often powerless and acted largely as a rubber stamp for the executive. In the new American Republic, however, the principle was brought to bear on the executive, on the head of state, as well. Here, too, the influence of Freemasonry is apparent. There is no question that Freemasonry contributed something to the structures and machinery of the new American government. Indeed, those structures are markedly diagrammatic, markedly geometrical in their design, reminiscent of the ingenious mechanical models produced by the Invisible College and the Royal Society a century before. They reflect an application to politics of the experimental methods so dear to the Invisible College and the Royal Society. They also reflect an application to politics of specifically architectonic principles. But if Freemasonry influenced the structures of American government, it was even more influential on the overall shape of that government. According to one commentator, quote, "Though free, we are not yet united. The loose Articles of Confederation do not provide a strong national government, common currency, or consistent judicial system. Men of vision realized that another step must be taken if the weak Confederation of American States was to become a strong, unified nation. Again, Freemasonry set the pattern in ideology and form. Since the Masonic federal system of organization was the only pattern for effective organization operating in each of the original 13 colonies, it was natural that patriotic brethren intent on strengthening the fledgling nation should turn to the organizational base of the craft for a model. Regardless of the other forces that affected the formation of the Constitution during the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the fact remains that the federalism established in the civil government this Constitution created is identical to the federalism of the Grand Lodge system of Masonic government created in Anderson's Constitutions in 1723. End quote. And I'm going to back up here because we have all of our pictures here. We have several, I think 4, yeah. So the first one is an English Masonic Knights Templar apron, circa 1800. Interesting. It's got. I'll just let you all see it. Come on. Lots and lots and lots of symbols there. Skull and bones. There's the serpent, the moon, sun. I'd have to really look at it to make out some of the rest of it, but the next one is Masonic sash worn by Benjamin Franklin as master of the French Lodge, Nine Sisters, in Paris, 1779 to 81. So here's his sash. We'll start low. There we go. Ben Franklin's sash. There we go. The third one is Masonic apron worn by George Washington and presented to him by General de Lafayette, embroidered by Madame de Lafayette in 1784. Madame de Lafayette. Okay. God. There we go. That one's a little bit harder to get because of the curve, but the four pillars. I mean, there really are. There are four. There are two on the outside, two there in the middle. The double X's, the pentagram. Okay, one more picture. Map of the City of Washington, 1792, incorporating modifications introduced by Washington and Jefferson. Indicated are the octagonal patterns centered upon the White House and the Capitol. So there's the two octagonal. Yeah, and I actually have a book that I will eventually read in here on all the, at least one person's theory on all of the symbolism and the architecture of the Capitol. All right, getting back to the text. This statement, so after this long quote, this statement comes from an American Freemasonic writer, and he is both overstating and oversimplifying his case. The reality was much less clear-cut, much more complicated, and emerged only gradually out of much energetic debate. And yet the general substance of the assertion remains valid. Freemasonry did provide a smoothly working model of an effective federal system, and perhaps the only such model of the time. That fact was much more apparent to the delegates at the Constitutional Convention than it is to us today, when federal systems obtain in a number of institutions and are pretty much taken for granted. In the 18th century, Freemasonry offered dramatic testimony to the effect that a federal system could work. It provided a desperately needed precedent. If such a system was demonstrably workable in Freemasonry, there was at least a prototype for its application to government. Masonic influence on the Constitution. As we have seen, the early events of the American War for Independence, the events from, say, the Boston Tea Party to the Declaration of Independence, had a momentum of their own. Men found themselves confronted almost daily with faits accomplis, of which they then had to make the best and on which they had to build. This had necessitated constant improvisation, in which a number of organizations were involved, not just Freemasonry, but also such fraternities as the Radical Sons of Liberty, and among the individuals playing prominent roles at the time, only a percentage of them were Freemasons. Freemasonry had exerted a moderating influence, but it was not the only influence at work, and it had neither the authority nor the latitude to shape things entirely in accordance with its ideals. Except in some of its rhetoric and phraseology, the Declaration of Independence, for example, could not be called a Freemasonic document. The Constitution of the United States, on the other hand, in a very real sense can. By the time the convention assembled to devise the Constitution, Freemasonic influences had prevailed and were unequivocally dominant. Other organizations, such as the Sons of Liberty, had, after serving their purpose, been dissolved. Even the Constitutional Army had been disbanded. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, Freemasonry was not just the only organization to have stayed the course, it was also the only real organizational apparatus of any kind operating across state boundaries throughout the newly independent colonies. In its final form, of course, the Constitution was a product of many minds and many hands, not all of them Freemasonic. The prose of the document itself was Thomas Jefferson's, and he, though sometimes claimed to have been a Freemason, was probably not. But there was ultimately 5 dominant and guiding spirits behind the Constitution: Washington, Franklin, Randolph, Jefferson, and John Adams. Of these, the first 3 were not only active Freemasons, but men who took their Freemasonry extremely seriously, men who subscribed fervently to its ideals, whose entire orientation had been shaped and conditioned by it. And Adams' position, though he himself is not known to have been a Freemason, was virtually identical to theirs. When he became president, moreover, he appointed a prominent Freemason, John Marshall, as his Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It was Marshall who subsequently established the court on a footing equal to that of Congress and the presidency. In the debates and discussions which eventually culminated in the Constitution, Adams, though not actually present at the time, was in accord with Washington, Franklin, and Randolph. Only Jefferson was odd man out, and it was Jefferson who eventually gave way, falling into line with the position of the Freemasons. The new republic, when it emerged with the Constitution, conformed to their ideal image, and that image reflected the ideals of Freemasonry. The Masonic leadership of Washington. On 17 September 1787, the draft Constitution was accepted, approved, and signed by 39 of the 42 delegates present. Between 7 December and 25 June of the following year, each of the states individually ratified it. Maryland ceded 10 square miles of its territory to Congress as specified by the Constitution, and this land, the District of Columbia, became the site of the new federal capital. On 4 February 1789, Washington was elected first president of the United States, and John Adams his vice president. The inauguration was on 30 April. The oath was administered by Robert Livingston, Grand Master of New York's Grand Lodge, and father-in-law of the dead General Richard Montgomery. The marshal of the day was another Freemason, General Jacob Morton. Yet another Freemason, General Morgan Lewis, was Washington's escort. The Bible used for the oath was that of St. John's Lodge, No. 1 of New York. Washington himself, at the time, was master of Alexandria Lodge, No. 22, Virginia. 13 days before the inauguration, Franklin had died, half of Philadelphia turning out for his funeral. 5 days after the inauguration, the French Estates General met at Versailles and on 17 June formed a National Assembly, declaring themselves not the king, the true representatives of the French people. On 14 July, a Parisian revolutionary mob stormed the Bastille. On 14 December, Alexander Hamilton submitted proposals for establishing a national bank. Jefferson opposed them, but Washington signed them through. On the American dollar bill was printed the Great Seal of the United States. It is unmistakably Freemasonic, an all-seeing eye in a triangle above a 13-stepped, four-sided pyramid, beneath which a scroll proclaims the advent of a new secular order, one of Freemasonry's long-standing dreams. On 18 September 1793, the cornerstone of the Capitol was officially laid. Grand Lodge of Maryland presided over the ceremony, and Washington was asked to serve as master. The affiliated lodges under Maryland's jurisdiction were in attendance, as was Washington's own lodge from Alexandria, Virginia. There was a great procession which included a company of artillery. Then came a band, followed by Washington himself, attended by all officers and members of the lodges in full regalia. When he reached the trench in which the southeast cornerstone was laid, Washington was presented with a silver plate commemorating the event and inscribed with the designations of the lodges in attendance. The artillery fired a volley. Washington then descended into the trench and placed the plate on the stone. Around it he placed containers of corn, wine, and oil, standard symbolic accoutrements of Freemasonic ritual. All present joined in a prayer and Masonic chanting, and the artillery fired another volley. Washington and his entourage then moved to the east of the cornerstone, where the president, standing on a traditionally Masonic three-stepped rostrum, delivered an oration. More Masonic chanting followed, and a final volley from the artillery. The gavel, the silver trowel, the square, and the level used by Washington for the ceremony are today held by Potomac Lodge No. 5 of the District of Columbia. The apron and the sash he wore are held by his own lodge, Alexandria No. 22. Subsequently, the Capitol and the White House were each to become focal points of an elaborate geometry governing the layout of the nation's capital city. This geometry, originally devised by an architect named Pierre L'Enfant, was subsequently modified by Washington and Jefferson so as to produce specifically octagonal patterns, incorporating the particular cross used as a device by Masonic Templars. 6 years and 3 months later, on December 1799, Washington died. He was buried at his home at Mount Vernon, with full Masonic honors by Alexandria Lodge No. 22, whose members were his pallbearers. Okay, that's the end of that chapter, so we just have the postscript left. And it is almost 5 pages. So here we go. In the American War for Independence, Freemasonry was ultimately apolitical or only incidentally political. There were Freemasons on both sides. There were Freemasons among radical and conservative factions on both sides. For the most part, Freemasonry constituted a voice of temperance and moderation, but some individual Freemasons were militantly revolutionary and others were staunchly reactionary. This kind of distribution was to continue for the duration of the 18th century and into the 19th, but in many people's minds, Freemasonry had become so closely associated with American Revolution and independence that it began increasingly to acquire a radical image. That image, needless to say, was to be reinforced by the French Revolution. Certainly Freemasonry played an important role in the events in France. Lafayette, by then a high-ranking and long-established Freemason, was eager to import to his own country the ideals he had seen actualized in America. Many of the leading Jacobins, Danton, for example, Sieyès, and Camille Desmoulins, were active Freemasons. Throughout France, on the eve of the Revolution, Freemasonry provided militant conspirators with a valuable network for intelligence, recruitment, communication, and organization. To that extent, it was already becoming an ideal repository for paranoia. In 1797, an ultra-conservative French prelate, the Abbé Augustin de Bérulle, published a book, Mémoires pour servir à la histoire de Jacobinisme. So, yeah. It doesn't translate it, but memoirs of the something of the history of Jacobinism, which was to become a perverse landmark in the history of Western social and political thought. Berulle's book, in effect, ascribed the whole of the French Revolution to a Freemasonic plot directed at both established secular authority and the Church. This work was to trigger a wave of hysteria, to sire a still growing corpus of similar literature, and to become a veritable Bible for adherents of conspiracy theories. From Berulle's rabidly paranoid text derived the cliched 19th century image still promulgated today of Freemasonry as a vast international conspiracy, revolutionary and militantly anti-clerical, dedicated to the overthrow of existing institutions and the establishment of a new world order. As a result of Berulle's nebulous and neurotic fears were to be projected not just onto Freemasonry, but onto secret societies in general. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, by virtue of Berulle, the secret society became a specter haunting the public mind and threatening to undermine the very foundations of civilized society. A bogeyman of a stature similar to that accorded with somewhat more justification international terrorism today. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Berulle's work became, on occasion, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Lured by the glamour and romanticism of Berulle's garish imagination, certain individuals, Charles Nodier in France, for example, and the rich conspirator Filippo Buonarroti, made a point of inventing, then writing, talking, and disseminating information about wholly fictitious secret societies. With inquisitional fervor, the authorities would respond accordingly, and perfectly innocent people would be harried and persecuted for alleged membership of these clandestine, non-existent organizations. As a defensive measure, the hapless victims would form themselves into a real secret society which conformed to the blueprint of the fictitious one. Thus a number of covert revolutionary cadres, some of them Masonic or quasi-Masonic, were born. Thus again, myth engendered history. Unquestionably, Freemasonry, or offshoots of Freemasonry, did contribute to various revolutionary movements in 19th century Europe. Both Mazzini and Garibaldi, for example, were active Freemasons, and Freemasonry, largely through the so-called Carbonaria, played an even more important role in the unification of Italy than it did in the foundation of the United States. In Russia, too, Freemasonry was deemed to be subversive, and sometimes was so. Pushkin, for instance, writes of his membership in a lodge in Kishinev, whose activities in the 1825 Decembrist plot led to a ban of all lodges in the country. Needless to say, the ban proved unenforceable, but it drove a number of Russian radicals into exile abroad, where they became heavily involved in foreign Freemasonry. Dostoevsky chronicles this process in The Possessed. The real-life equivalent of Dostoevsky's revolutionaries was, of course, Bakunin. Ultimately, however, the reality of the situation was more complex and less clearly definable. If Freemasons were active in the revolutionary movements of 19th century Europe, they were equally active in such regimes as Metternich's Austria, for example, or the Prussia of Frederick Wilhelm III and IV. Here Freemasonry was as entwined with the establishment as it was in Britain, where Grand Lodge continued to exemplify the Victorian virtues of sobriety, temperance, and moderation. Even in France, there were as many conservative Freemasons as there were radicals and revolutionaries. A list of 19th century European Freemasons is illuminating simply by virtue of its lack of consistency. On the one hand, it includes such figures as Mazzini, Garibaldi, Bakunin, the young Alexander Kerensky in Russia, Daniel O'Connell, and Henry Grattan in Ireland. On the other hand, it also includes two 19th century kings of Prussia, three French presidents, Doumer, Faure, and Gambetta, and that nemesis of political unrest, Talleyrand in Britain. The list of 19th century Freemasons includes George IV, William IV, Edward, Prince of Wales, subsequently Edward VII, Canning, Lord Randolph Churchill, the Marquis of Salisbury, and Cecil Rhodes. Most of Napoleon's marshals were Freemasons, but so too were their most prominent adversaries, Nelson, Wellington, and Sir John Moore in Britain. Kutuzov in Russia, Blücher in Prussia, as well as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the founders of the Prussian General Staff. In the arts, English Freemasons included Sir Walter Scott, Richard Haggard, Bulwer Lytton, Conan Doyle, Trollope, Kipling, and Wilde. On the continent, Pushkin's radical Freemasonry in Russia was offset by that in Germany of the arch-conservative Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This list is necessarily selective and by no means definitive. It serves, however, to illustrate the impossibility of ascribing any political orientation or even political consistency to Freemasonry, and what applies in Europe applies elsewhere as well. In Latin America, for example, as in Spain, Italy, and other Catholic countries, Freemasonry offered a focus of opposition to the stranglehold of the Church. In consequence, most of the figures associated with Latin American independence, such as Bolivar, San Martin, and later Juarez, were active Freemasons. But so too were the Spanish viceroys, aristocrats, and landowners from whom they wrested their fledgling republics, modeled assiduously on the pattern of the United States. In Brazil, both the empire of Pedro II and the republic that supplanted it were dominated by Freemasonry. To the north, at least a dozen American presidents, apart from Washington, are known to have been Freemasons. Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Polk, Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Garfield, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Harding, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Truman, and Ford. Texas's war for independence from Mexico was effectively directed by Freemasons such as Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and other defenders of the Alamo were all members of the same strict observance lodge. During the American Civil War, Freemasonry was prevalent on both sides, but played a particularly important role in the institutions, and especially the Army of the Confederacy. All of that, however, to coin a cliché, is another story. So too was the Masonic origins of the Ku Klux Klan, which was not initially the noxious organization it later became, but a charitable institution designed to protect widows and orphans from the depredations of northern carpetbaggers. It is in America that our story comes full circle, for it is there that the Knights Templar have received the most fulsome public homage to be paid them anywhere in the world. This homage takes the form of a youth organization sponsored by Freemasonry, the Order of Demolay. The Order of Demolay was established in Kansas City, Missouri in 1919 by one Frank S. Land and, quote, takes its name from Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of medieval Knights Templar, who was burned at the stake on an island in the Seine River near the Cathedral of Notre Dame on March 18, 1314, for his fidelity and integrity to the members of his order. End quote. The Order of Demolay numbers some 85 chapters in all 50 of the United States, in the District of Columbia, and in 12 nations abroad. From its headquarters in Kansas City, it is governed by an international Supreme Council which operates under the auspices of Grand Lodge of Florida and is composed of 250 eminent Masons from throughout the world. Each local chapter must be sponsored by a Masonic body, and the governing body or adversary council of each chapter must consist of Master Masons. Membership in the order itself consists of boys between the ages of 14 and 21. Quote, Demolay, through initiation, teaches 7 virtues. They are filial love, love of parents, reverence, reverence for sacred things, courtesy, comradeship, fidelity, cleanness, cleanness of thought, word, and deed, and patriotism. End quote. One cannot but wonder what boys in the order are taught about Jacques de Molay himself, about the Templars, and about the particular transgressions of which they were accused. To our knowledge, there is no mention of any of that in the order's literature. That literature does, however, albeit with somewhat imperfect syntax, elaborate on the order's objectives. Quote, the Order of Demolay tries to supplement the teachings of home, church, and school, thereby better fitting a young man for duties of citizenship, which is his rightful heritage. De Molay is unalterably opposed to a church, a school, and the seat of civil government being housed under one roof. It feels that these 3 freedoms are the cause of our country's greatness and must stand on their own foundations and under separate roofs. End quote. To our knowledge, there is nothing in any sense pernicious about the Order of Demolay. On the contrary, it does laudable enough work and probably offers a more or less sane corrective for some of the ills to which America is prone, such as militant fundamentalism. But it is all rather remote from the white-mantled warrior mystics who sought to storm heaven with their swords 700 years ago, and there is perhaps a slightly Garcia Marquez-esque quality about their existence, the very existence of this organization, issuing from the heart of Middle America, dedicated to fostering personal and civic virtues in generations of American youth, yet named after a medieval French knight executed for blasphemy, heresy, sodomy, necromancy, and assorted other forms of misconduct that would mortify even the Ewings of Dallas, the Carringtons of Denver, and all the depraved denizens of Peyton Place. One is tempted to imagine the bearded old Templar Grand Master himself gazing down or up on the organization which today bears his name. Would he be touched, flattered, amused, or simply mystified? The end. Like I said, there are 2 appendices. They are just lists of lodges, field lodges, and some of the major names associated with them. And that is it. So, very interesting read, that is for sure. And there's a hell of a bibliography in the back of it to draw other sources from if I choose to. But that'll be that. We'll end this session. And I need a break. But then I'm going to play some We Happy Few, I think. It's still early enough. Thursday, we start into 1984, which will be interesting. I have not actually ever read it. I think I've said that before. Never read it. It never was even on my radar as a young man, and now it seems like, from what I've heard about it over the decades, that it is very, very relevant to our times. So I want to get into it, and hopefully you will all enjoy the read and maybe learn something. Anyway, I will take my break. I'll end this session, and I will see you in the next one.